We're looking at the theory that the resurrection was just a legend, and this is an increasingly common and popular view these days. You'll hear it often in resurrection debates, you'll see it in the movie The God Who Wasn't There, and you'll read it in the books by Bart Ehrman and the Jesus Seminar. And we said in the previous video that this belief had two foundations. The first was that the belief in the resurrection was just a fable, a legend, a myth that grew over the years and decades afterwards and evolved. And we showed in the last video, using only the sources that the most skeptical scholars accept, such as the first letter of Paul to the Corinthians and the letter of Paul to the Galatians, that this is not possible, that the belief in the resurrection can be traced back to within a year of the crucifixion itself, if not earlier. Some scholars say to within months of the crucifixion. And therefore there was no time for this belief to have evolved. It was there right from the very start of Christianity. But now we come to the second foundation, which is that the Gospels and Acts were written generations later. And so they say that there's this gap of decades after the events recorded in the Gospels and when the Gospels were actually written. And this was giving the time for the legend to grow. None of the Gospels could have been written before the year AD 70. And so Mark was written first because it's the shortest and simplest, and that would be sometime shortly after AD 70. Then that's 40 years after the events it contains. Then you've got Matthew and Luke, which were written a decade or two after Mark, and so that's AD 80 or 90, so you're getting into 60 years after the events. And then you've got the Gospel of John, written last because it has the most exalted language about Jesus. And this was written sometime 110 AD, 130 AD even. So that puts it 80 to 100 years after the events that it claims are eyewitness records. So that shows that these documents were written at least one generation, if not two, or in the case of John, 3 generations after the events themselves. So they could not possibly be eyewitness records. Instead, they were anonymous accounts written later that were then, around the end of the 2nd century, ascribed to Matthew and Mark and Luke and John to try and raise their status so that they could claim acceptance. So what's the result of this belief? Well, the result is that you can dismiss all that is written in the Gospels and Acts because they cannot possibly be eyewitness accounts from the time and place. Therefore, they're not historical evidence. They cannot be used as historical evidence to try and bolster the arguments about the resurrection. In fact, they're just not historical documents at all. They're just a collection of fables and myths and hearsay. Some people say that as a result, maybe Jesus never even existed at all, although this is rare because there are extra-biblical sources for Jesus. But what they do say is that it's not possible from the Gospels to know anything accurately about the life of Jesus or the teachings of Jesus. And so what you've got to do is to deconstruct these Gospels. You've got to strip out all the fabrications that have been added to get back to the core and to try and find the true historical Jesus who is hidden in here somewhere amongst all of these later additions and fables. And you can just dismiss the resurrection completely because that is just Chinese whispers that developed into a legend to eventually claim that Jesus was the Son of God. Well, we've already shown in the previous video that belief in the resurrection did not evolve over time. It was there right from the start. But what about this question of the late date of the Gospels, and therefore they couldn't possibly be eyewitness accounts? This date of 1 to 3 generations afterwards, 40 to maybe even 100 years written after the facts. They say the reason for this is because none of the Gospels could have been written before AD 70. Why not? Why is this the claim that is made? Well, it's built on one single reason, and that is that in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus prophesies or predicts the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, and this took place in AD 70. And because it's not possible that Jesus could have accurately prophesied this ahead of time, these Gospels had to have been written after AD 70 and then have included or backdated this claim into themselves in order to show that Jesus had made this prophecy. But of course, that is all just a fraud. So that's the only reason for dating the Gospels late. Was there any evidence that the Gospels may have been written earlier than AD 70 and Acts written earlier than AD 70? Well, yes, actually, there's three types of evidence that they were written earlier. The first is internal evidence within the Bible itself, the New Testament itself. 1 Timothy chapter 5 verse 18 quotes the Gospel of Luke as scripture, as being on a par with the Old Testament revelation of God. So think how widespread and how highly accepted Luke's Gospel had to have been by that time for it to be considered on a par with the Old Testament scriptures, which had been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. 1 Corinthians 11, which is written in 53 to 55 AD, contains echoes and allusions also to Luke's Gospel. So that potentially gives us a much earlier date for Luke, certainly earlier than 90 AD, which is the claim. And Luke, he has allusions and references to Mark within his Gospel, so that would put Mark even earlier than that. And then James's letter contains loads of allusions to Matthew's Gospel, and James died in AD 62, so that would put Matthew much earlier as well. If Acts was written after AD 70, and Acts is a history of the early church, why does Acts not contain such a significant event as the destruction of the temple? Or the siege of Jerusalem, which preceded it in around 66 to 67 AD? Or the persecutions of the Christians by Nero in around 65 AD? And why does Acts, which follows the stories of Peter and Paul, not include the deaths of Peter and Paul in 65 and 66 AD if it was written so late? And why not include the death of James, who's also mentioned in Acts, who died in AD 62? You see, there's all this evidence that it wasn't written after AD 70. And if the Gospels were written after AD 70, why not increase the detail of the prophecy about the destruction of the temple so that you can kind of exalt Jesus even higher? Look how right he got it. Look at all this wealth of detail he told us, instead of this much more bare bones prophecy that we really get. That would make Jesus look even better. Or why not include a little comment after the prophecy saying, and this is exactly what took place, just as Jesus had said, if it was written after AD 70. The Bible does that when it quotes earlier prophecy and then the fulfillment. Why didn't they do that in the Gospels as well if they're written so late? What's the evidence that they are indeed eyewitness testimony? Well, all the Gospels contain all kinds of tiny details about customs of the time, about the geography of the area, about the leaders and the political situation of the time. And these are always accurate and correct, right down to the frequency of names that exist in census data at the time being the correct frequency for the same names occurring and the number of times they occur in the Gospels themselves. And that's very hard to fabricate if you're writing this decades after and in a different place, particularly as you don't have libraries of this kind of information that you can refer to try and aid your fabrication. Luke who wrote Luke's Gospel and Acts, is considered a highly reliable historian, because every piece of archaeological evidence discovered has backed up the things that Luke has said. And even when it comes to different names and titles given to different types of leader and ruler in different districts and areas, Luke is always accurate and gets these things correct. In Luke's Gospel, there's a change in the administrative structure to a region between the birth of Jesus and the baptism of Jesus. And Luke gets the details of this change correct in just a subtle comment that is made in Luke's Gospel. And remember, there's no Google back in those days. You can't make this kind of detailed evidence up or kind of historically research it. It all shows that they were there at the time. Then we also have external evidence of the early dates of the Gospels. Polycarp was a man who was whose life overlapped with John, who wrote the fourth Gospel. And in his writings, he quotes Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Clement of Rome was even earlier than Polycarp, and he quotes from Matthew or Mark or Luke in his writings. And then you've got a guy called Papias, who actually writes about Matthew's Gospel and writes about Mark's Gospel. And this is what he says. Mark, having been the interpreter of Peter, wrote down what Peter preached accurately, though not necessarily in order. Matthew wrote the logia, the oracles or the sayings of Jesus, in the Hebrew language. And so he is saying that these Gospels are so widely spread by his time that he can just talk about them and talk about their history, even though he's writing at the very start of the 2nd century. And interestingly as well, he gets Matthew correct in that the structure of Matthew is all built around the sayings and the long teaching sections of Jesus. So he gets the distinctives of that Gospel correct as well. And in Justin Martyr, by the mid-2nd century, so around the year 150, he says that the Gospels were being read in the churches as scripture. So think how widely spread and how authoritative the Gospels were accepted as by the year 150, that they were on a par with the Old Testament scriptures of God and read in the churches throughout the Roman Empire. Think of how long that would have all taken to happen, and that's the case by the time that he's writing. What about this claim that the Gospels were first written anonymously and then only later, at the end of the 2nd century, claimed to be written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John to try and raise their status? Well, if that were true, we would expect to find anonymous copies of the Gospels as they spread around the Roman Empire. So some of our manuscript copies we would expect to be anonymous, or some we would expect to be wrongly attributed to the wrong kind of person. So to increase the status, maybe they ascribe Mark to Andrew, one of the disciples, or maybe they ascribe Luke to Silvanus or Titus or Apollos or something like that. But every named copy that we have is unanimous in giving the right name to the right gospel. And it's also unanimous in the very way that the titles of each gospel is written. So there is no evidence of unanimous, of anonymous gospels spreading throughout the Roman Empire. And the first claim that the gospels were written anonymously was made in the year AD 40 by Faustus. So that's 350 years after the time in which they were written. He makes this claim. That would be the equivalent of someone 100 years from now starting to claim, we don't know who wrote the Declaration of Independence. All the evidence for the 350 years before Faustus is that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote their Gospels. And if you were making that up to try and increase the status, why would you choose Luke? Why someone who is not very well known and has no authority as an apostle, an eyewitness, but who collected the eyewitness data? And why Mark? Mark had actually fallen out of favour with the Apostle Paul due to a fight that he caused between Barnabas and Paul, a disagreement because Mark had let them down on one of the missionary journeys and had gone off home and left them in the lurch. Why would you pick him as someone to increase the status of your gospel? And if Mark was recording simply what Peter's eyewitness testimony was, why not call it the Gospel of Peter? That would give it great status. But no, everywhere it is called the Gospel of Mark because they were very strict and careful about recording who was the actual author of each gospel account. So we've seen this second foundation, that the Gospels were written generations after the events, is only built on one presupposition, that it's not possible that they could contain a prediction about AD 70. And we've seen that there's ample evidence to call this belief into question. And so we see that the legendary view of the resurrection is built on these two foundations, neither of which fit the facts of the evidence we have.